We've talked a bit about how we might manage or understand animal behavior. Today in class, we're going to look at how we might understand the basis for diet selection behavior. In other words, try to understand why animals select what they eat and avoid what they avoid. So in integrated range management today, I'm going to talk about the basis for diet selection. Before we get going, we need to distinguish between two terms, palatability and preference. The best definition for palatability is simply the attractiveness as a plant for forage. Of course, this is a general term. We as humans would say that a food was palatable if it was desirable or attractive. You know, it sounded like a good kind of food. It would be palatable for us. Same term for animals. Preference is a little bit different. Preference is when you offer an animal two or more foods and they make a choice between them. The food that they prefer is the one that they eat the most of. And so both of these terms are similar in that they're based on this relationship between flavor and feedback. So they have a certain flavor based on their chemical structure, and they also have feedback in terms of nutrients or toxins that change the animal's opinion of the food. What's interesting is that relationship is based on animal physiological condition, how hungry they are, whether they had protein, if they need water, their physiological condition. The second thing is it's dependent on the plant's chemical characteristics, how digestible, how nutritious is the food, what kinds of compounds does it have. And then third, it's dependent on the animal's previous experience with the food. Is this a familiar food, a new food, one that was aversive in the past, etc. Today we're going to focus largely on that last point about experience with foods and how that's gained. Throughout this presentation, I'll try to point out some of the main principles, and here's a first set of principles. Palatability, or the attractiveness of plant, depends on feedback. Plants are not palatable or unpalatable inherently. They are learned behavior, so it's a learned characteristic about a plant that's dependent on feedback. Animals can detect positive feedback in the form of nutrients or energy, and they can also detect negative feedback that comes from anti-quality factors or toxins. So animals have this ability. And then finally, animals can discriminate among foods based on their flavor-feedback relationship, based on their expected feedback from eating a food. So 3 principles. Let's go through all of those. I'll give you some examples. First of all, remember that taste is just an inherent characteristic of a plant or a food. When an animal eats a food, they get digestive feedback. If that digestive feedback is positive, they get some energy or nutrient boost from the plant, then they form a preference for that plant. So then we might say that plant was palatable, or they might actually prefer it over others in a test. So they have a preference for the food. On the other hand, if they eat a plant and the digestive feedback is negative, they get ill, especially if they get nauseous from the food. Then they'll form an aversion to the food, and if they were given a choice among foods, they would avoid the food that made them sick. So again, the key is that the flavor in of itself has very little value. It only has value because of the feedback that's gained after the animal tastes the flavor. We call that a hedonic shift. They have a hedonic shift in the flavor. The flavor changes, becomes more positive or more negative. The reason that this works is just because of the way the body was made. There are thousands of pathways of neurons that go from an animal's tongue to their gut. So the animal is really designed for linking up flavor with feedback. Some say there's more nerves connecting your gut to your tongue than anywhere else in your body. It's a really important characteristic because if you don't make the right diet choices, then you'll die. You'll die of toxic plants in the case of herbivores. So it's a really important thing. There's a lot of neurons in the body that help the animal to connect the flavor of a food with the digestive feedback. So one principle we know is that the amount of energy in a food increases palatability. So foods become more preferred or more palatable if their consumption is followed by an energy boost. So this was a simple experiment that Juan Villalba and Fred Provenza did quite some time ago. They had some straw, and on odd days the sheep ate straw, and one group ate apple-flavored straw, and then they were given a dose of water directly into their rumen through a tube. The second group, Group 2, had maple-flavored straw, and they were given a dose of water. On the even days, every other day, on even days, Group 1 got maple-flavored straw, and then they were given a water and starch compound, or a mix that was put into their rumen. Group 2 got apple-flavored straw, and they were given this starch solution. So, in other words, on even days, Group 1 ate maple-flavored straw, and they got energy. Group 2 ate apple-flavored straw, and they got an energy boost. So then Juan and others and his colleagues tested the sheep, and they just asked them, which do you prefer, apple or maple-flavored straw? To look at it, which flavor do you think that Group 1 preferred? Well, it's pretty simple. It didn't really actually matter if it was maple or apple. In all cases, animals preferred the straw that was paired with starch. So on day 9, after the conditioning started, already there was a difference where the sheep preferred the flavor of straw that was paired with starch. And then over time, there were a few changes in the protocol. One increased the amount of starch a little bit, but overall, as animals learned this relationship, they became more and more selective of the flavor that was paired with the starch. So they had a higher and higher preference for the flavored straw that gave them an energy boost after they ate it. Okay, it's really nice to look at graphs like this, but let's see it in real life. I'm going to show you this video. So next comes a video on sheep responding to straw that had been infused or not infused with starch. So here's the video. As I started working on this and started understanding that animals respond to positive feedback, I wanted to know why do animals like things that are more digestible than other foods? Because we know that if you look at the foods that animals eat in their diet, they'll always select digestible foods over less digestible foods. And I had a theory that perhaps this was because foods that are really digestible and have lots of soluble carbohydrates give an energy boost quicker than those that are fermentable carbohydrates, or those that are, in the case of plants, even lignified carbohydrates that aren't accessible. So a student of mine, Liz Smith, did a project out at the Sheep Research Center here on campus, and she fed sheep one kind of flavored straw and then immediately gave them starch water delivered into their rumen, similar to what Dr. Juan Villalba did. The second group got a flavor of starch got a flavor of straw on the second day, and they got feedback. They still got starch, but they didn't get it right away. They got it 8 hours after they ate. And then the third day, animals got a flavor of straw for which they just got water, and they got water 1 hour after eating and then 7 hours after eating. So these, we had several sets of sheep, and every day they got straw that was either paired with immediate feedback that would be similar to the kind of energy that would come from soluble carbohydrates, or they got a flavored straw that was paired with delayed feedback. So they had something that would be equivalent to fermentable carbohydrates or fermentable compounds in the rumen that yielded energy. And then finally the last set would be a group of animals that got very little energy from the food, just that kind of lignified or really not very fermentable carbohydrates. It's pretty remarkable. The results show that animals relatively quickly learned to prefer. They had a preference for the food that gave them immediate feedback. Second, they preferred the one that gave them that delayed or 8 hours later feedback, and then their lowest preference was for the flavor of straw that was paired with water only. So on the fourth trial, which was a few weeks after the beginning of the conditioning, and the fifth trial and the sixth trial, you see that there's a very strong pattern of animals preferring the immediate feedback, and that gets stronger and stronger over time. So animals really do learn to prefer feeds that give them an energy boost shortly after they eat. So this is the basis of why animals can distinguish between foods that are more or less more or less digestible. The flip side of that coin, we've been talking about conditioned preferences. Now let's talk a little bit about conditioned aversions. So what happens if an animal eats a food and gets some negative feedback? we're pretty sure that they're going to form a lower preference, or that food has become less palatable. So Beth Burritt, a friend of mine, and Fred Provenza did an experiment quite some time ago. This was at the beginning of us trying to understand diet selection. And Beth gave sheep potted mountain mahogany plants, and one group of the sheep, half of them, ate the mountain mahogany and got a lithium chloride capsule. Lithium chloride is a compound that has very few effects on the animal, but one thing we do know it does is it creates nausea. We actually know this because it's a compound that was used in humans for behavior modification, and we know that humans felt sick when they ate it, and it turns out that sheep also feel this nausea. So one group got a capsule of lithium chloride, which created nausea. The other group got just an empty capsule. So apparently they didn't feel any feedback except the energy that would be gained from the mountain mahogany. Didn't take the sheep long to figure this out. On day 1, they all ate about the same number of bites of mountain mahogany, a little more than 60 on this graph. Didn't matter whether they were in the control group or the averted group. Right after they ate that, Beth gave the averted group the lithium chloride. She gave them 3 grams of lithium chloride. And then by the next day, when Beth gave the sheep the mountain mahogany, they didn't want it very much. They really cut down on the amount that they ate, whereas the control group, who had just gotten an empty capsule, started increasing their intake over time. So day 3, 4, 5, increasing intake because the food was becoming more and more familiar, and they were getting energy from the mountain mahogany, so they were getting positive feedback. On the other hand, the averted group, every time they would eat 10 or 15 bites, Beth would give them a bit of lithium chloride. So every time they ate mountain mahogany, they got negative feedback. They became nauseous. Didn't take them long to learn. By day 3, they were just nibbling, just 1 or 2 bites, just to see if anything had changed. So Beth was really quite handily created an aversion to mountain mahogany among these sheep, and that's weird because sheep would normally eat mountain mahogany. It's a perfectly acceptable food, but because of feedback that she gave them, an induced nausea event, they quit eating mountain mahogany. That's called a conditioned aversion. And another thing that we know, another principle about preferences and aversions, is that the magnitude of feedback matters. The stronger the feedback, the stronger the resulting preference or aversion. So foods that are very satisfying and really have strong positive benefit, those are the kinds of foods you form a strong preference for. So for sheep, it's things that have lots of soluble carbohydrates and probably soluble proteins that hit their system very quickly. For humans, it's usually things that are salty and fatty. Bacon is one that I can think of that has very strong preference because it has very strong positive feedback. Salt, protein, fat. So it's a food that is sort of inherently set up to be preferred among humans if you eat meat, I guess. The flip side of that is the more sick an animal gets after eating a food, the more nauseous they feel, the stronger the aversion to that food will be. So many of you may have aversions to food. You might think about what foods you really hate, and you might be able to tie it back to a specific event or not. In class when we talked about this, several students had an aversion to bananas, and I assume that's because when they were very young, children are often fed bananas, and children often get sick for a number of reasons and are rather colicky. So it might have been the bananas that made them sick, it might have been something else, but apparently, at least for many students in this class, when they ate bananas, they got sick. They don't even remember it, but I will bet money that somewhere in their life they ate a food, in this case bananas, and it made them ill, and they formed an aversion to it. Here was an experiment that Johann Dutoy did where he fed sheep, I'm thinking he fed them wheat, and it was a grain, and he offered them a choice between a couple of grains, and right after they ate the first set of grain, he gave them lithium chloride. So one group got no lithium chloride, one got a little bit, 1 gram, 2 grams, 3 grams, 5 grams, and 8 grams. And what you find is when Johann offered the sheep a choice between 2 grains, the ones that had gotten no lithium chloride really had no preference for or against the grain that was paired with the feedback. However, 1, 2, 3, you started to see a reduction in preference for the food that was paired with the lithium chloride, and really strong feedback, 5 and 8 grams of lithium chloride chloride really reduced the intake of those grains, and the animals expressed a really low preference. In fact, I inherited these sheep from Johann's study to do some other research, and those sheep that were in those high lithium chloride treatments, they didn't like anything. They didn't want to try anything new. My experiment was on trying to get animals to eat new foods, and those animals had gotten so sick in Johann's experiment that not only did they not like the wheat, but they didn't like anything new. Here's an experiment that I did in my dissertation. My question here was if animals could learn to moderate their diet over time based on how much toxins, or in this case lithium chloride, was in the feed. Because we know that animals, when they experience a little bit of illness, they can't completely quit eating foods because nearly every range plant has some kind of toxin or secondary compound. If animals never ate anything that had a secondary compound in it, there really wouldn't be much left for them to eat on the range. And we know that animals moderate how much they eat of plants over time. So I did this experiment where I had oats, and one group of lambs got oats with 0% lithium chloride, the other got oats with 0.75% lithium chloride mixed into it. In this case, lithium chloride tastes tastes salty to them, so it really wasn't an aversive flavor, except that it does make them nauseous. The third group got 1.5% lithium chloride, and what's interesting is right away, within a day or so, when I started measuring their intake, the animals that had low lithium chloride ate all that I gave them of the oats, which was about I ended up giving them a little less than 500 grams, and they pretty much increased their intake till they would eat all that I gave them. The ones that had little lithium chloride in ate some less, and the ones that had 1.5% lithium chloride ate half of the amount that those that had 0.75% lithium chloride. So in other words, if I doubled the amount of lithium chloride in the food, the animals ate half the amount of that food. So it's really clear evidence that animals are able to vary their intake of foods that have toxins, and that we know that those toxins could change over time, and animals could detect the differences. There's a blip up on about day 5 and 6 in this 5 and 7 in this experiment, and that was just because I think it got colder. There was some change in barometric pressure, so the only thing I can attribute that to is just some change in the weather where animals were just eating more in general. Okay, so here's another principle, that animals can tell what food made them feel good or ill even when they're eating dozens of meals in a food. So we know that toxins vary over time. We also know that animals don't eat one food at a time, or at least generalist herbivores don't. So sheep and cattle, they eat many plants per day. So if something makes them sick, how do they know what it was that made them sick? How would animals distinguish among the many foods that they ate that day and try to decide what made them feel good and what made them feel ill? Any ideas? Well, the first and most important factor is neophobia, or novel flavors. So animals have a healthy dislike for new things. They like to get some experience with a food or with an activity, and they might grow to learn it, to like it over time. But initially, they don't. So neophobia is this fear of new things, and in how we see it in diet selection is that it creates low intake of new foods. So here was an experiment that Fred Provenza and colleagues did. He gave animals rice in this experiment. Rice was a new food for them. On day 1, they didn't eat very much at all of it. Day 2, they ate a bit more. By day 3, they were eating it pretty well, and increased day 5 and day 6. And then Fred and his colleagues put a novel flavor on the food. And I think it was cinnamon in this case, or maybe it was oregano, but at any rate, they put a spice on the rice, and that made this familiar food new in some way. That novel familiar gave that novel flavor gave the food a new aspect, and the animals went down in eating it on day 7. But then day 8, they didn't get sick, so on day 8 they increased, and then on day 9 they increased. And I'm sure that if this experiment had gone on 10, 11, 12, we would have seen just increasing levels of intake. So in other words, the principle here is that animals slowly start eating new foods, and when you put a new attribute on a familiar food, you can decrease the consumption of it. That's important, that animals are sensitive to what are the new foods versus the familiar foods in their environment. And the next point that's important there is that when animals do get sick after eating a dozen foods or so, if they get sick, they're going to blame the novel food. So here's an experiment that Beth Burritt did. On day 1, she gave sheep oats, barley, alfalfa, corn, and rye. And on day 1, they liked the rye, the oats, and the barley fine. They didn't like the alfalfa quite as much because it was a familiar food, but it wasn't as high an energy source as oats, barley, and rye. They didn't eat as much corn because in a previous experiment, the sheep had gotten sick when they were eating corn. So on day 2, so day 1, the animals ate a lot of those grains, barley, oats, and rye, not so much alfalfa, not so much corn. Then she gave them a dose of lithium chloride, and immediately the animals first blamed the novel food, the rye. They had never had that before, except on day 1 of this experiment, and when they got sick, they immediately blamed the novel food. They also blamed a food that had made them ill in the past, and that was corn. However, they did not blame the oats, the barley, and the alfalfa because those were familiar foods to them. So now we know 2 reasons, 2 ways that animals might figure out what made them ill if they're eating a meal with many foods. They would avoid novel foods, they would blame the novel food, and they would blame foods that made them sick in the past. Well, novelty is very important, but there's other factors that play a role. So novel versus familiar food, blame the new food. Prior experience, blame the food that made you ill in the past. Generalization is the idea that if you had a food that was similar to a food that had made you sick in the past, so if you ate a new food but it was maybe of the same genus or had some of the same flavors as a food that you had avoided in the past, then you would blame that food. Also, whichever food made up the most of the diet, the bulk of the diet, that might be another food that an animal would blame for making them sick. And then finally, what was the last food they ate? So they usually blame the food that was eaten most recently before they got sick. So these are all principles by which animals can distinguish and figure out which food made them ill or made them feel better when they're eating diets of many foods. Here, just to make that point about generalization, here was an experiment that I did, again, in my dissertation, and what we found here was that I raised sheep on cinnamon-flavored rice, and half of the sheep, when they ate cinnamon-flavored rice, I gave them a dose of lithium chloride, so they were averted to cinnamon-flavored rice. So the dark bar there is the sheep that were averted to cinnamon-flavored rice. And then I gave all of the sheep a choice between cinnamon-flavored wheat and wheat without cinnamon. And what we found was the animals that had been averted to rice-flavored, cinnamon-flavored rice, they ate a lot of the regular wheat, but not hardly any of the cinnamon-flavored wheat. Whereas the ones that had not been averted, cinnamon was a familiar flavor to them, and it did not give them any digestive feedback, the gold bars. They ate about the same amount of the cinnamon-flavored rice as they did cinnamon-flavored wheat as they did the the plain wheat. So a similar thing for us might be if you had gotten averted to cinnamon-flavored toast, you might not like cinnamon rolls, or you might not like cinnamon gum, or you might not like cinnamon candies, because they all have that common flavor. And on the range, there's probably foods that have similar common flavor elements, like all sages. When we smell them, they all have a similar odor. They probably have a similar flavor for ruminants. Here's another really important principle about how animals know what to eat and what to avoid. That is to learn from others. Lambs, calves, does, fawns, they are born into multi-generational groups. They're gregarious animals. So step number 1 to figuring out what to eat is ask for directions. It turns out the most important animals to ask for directions are from your mother and your peers. And we'll talk about why mom is such an important social model. This idea of asking for directions or getting input from others in your herd is called social facilitation. That's the area of research with which this idea comes from. So social facilitation is the principle, and in social facilitation we have social models like mother and peers. Okay, we know that mother is the most important social model. But why? Why is a mom an important social model? Why should young animals pay a lot of attention to mother and what she's eating. Well, in class we discussed at least 3 important reasons. 1, mother was successful. She survived to reproduce, so at least she lived long enough to reproduce. So she's been successful in some way, shape, or form. Secondly, she's there. When an animal is born, it's certain that that young offspring's mother is going to be there. So it's a certainty that mother is going to be there. And the third one is a little less easy to think about, but very important. That's that mother is similar to her offspring. Offspring inherit their physiological, morphological, and neurological abilities from their mother. They also inherit from their father, of course, but mother is there, and at least half of her genetics is part of her offspring. So if the mother was not able to tolerate some toxin, it's likely the young also would not be able to tolerate that. On the other hand, if mother was able to digest a secondary compound, it's likely that the offspring would also be able to. So mother is an important social model because she's there, because she's obviously been successful to reproduce, and she has similar abilities based on genetic relationships and inheritance. So we know that lambs eat what mom eats. Sarwat Mirza, a colleague of mine, did some experiments where he looked at how strong was mother's influence on lambs. He had a set of ewes that he trained to eat serviceberry simply by giving them serviceberry and letting them experience the positive benefits of eating serviceberry. Those same ewes were trained to avoid mountain mahogany. So mountain mahogany is generally a fine shrub. Animals eat it. This is true mountain mahogany, Cercocarpus montanus. And then he let the lambs interact with their mothers while their mothers were avoiding serviceberry and eating mountain mahogany. And then he took the lambs away from the mothers and he asked the lambs, which shrub do you prefer? And here are the results. The animals definitely ate the serviceberry, which is the food that mother ate, and they avoided the mountain mahogany. Even though they had never gotten sick, they themselves had never eaten mountain mahogany and gotten sick. They were simply avoiding the food that mom avoided and eating the food that mother ate. And what's interesting is that this trend stayed through even into weaning. So right after weaning, days 1 through 7 after weaning, animals that still preferred serviceberry over mountain mahogany because their mothers had, and 2 months later, 62 days, 63 through 68 days, they still avoided that serviceberry over the mountain mahogany. So there might be ways to get them over that preference for serviceberry, but at least it lasted several months past weaning in this group of lambs. And now just to give you a sense of what that looks like in the real world, animals eating what mother eats and avoiding what mother avoids, I've got a video for you. So insert that video right here. Another important thing is that mother's influence is strong, but it also lasts a long time. This was a really revealing experiment done by Green in Australia. And on the left bar there, he gave sheep wheat when they were lambs, young lambs. He gave them wheat for 1 hour a day for 5 days at 6 weeks of age. So they were fairly young. The first group, the nun, of course, they got no wheat when they were young, and then 34 months later, so when they were nearly 3 years after never having received wheat, Dr. Green asked those ewes now, 3-year-old ewes, if they liked wheat, and the group that had not received it when they were young did not eat it very well. There was another group that when they were 6-week-old lambs, they had received a little bit of wheat all alone. They didn't have anyone else in their pen, just them. And then 3 months later they ate a little bit of it, and when they were 34 months old they ate a little bit of wheat, but not much at all. They had not received any in that time period. The third group received wheat at 6 weeks of age with their mother. 3 months later they ate quite a bit of wheat. They ate almost 200 grams, which is like 4 cups of wheat. So they really ate quite a lot. And then 3 years later, when they were 3 years old, 34 months of age, after not having received wheat at all, when they were offered wheat again, they ate 350 grams. So in other words, they learned from their mother when they were young. 3 months later, they recognized this food and ate quite a bit of it. 3 years later, they still recognized the food and ate a lot of it. So mother's influence is strong. They learn quickly from mother, and they remember it for years and years. You know, people often say that sheep are stupid. Yeah, and they are. They're not good at higher math and a lot of other cognitive skills, but they are really good at remembering what they ate because it's very important to their to them surviving. One of the things that can really help this break down is peers. So peers also influence intake. And this was a pretty revealing experiment that Dr. Ralphs from the Poisonous Plants Lab at Utah did. He wanted to see if he could avert animals to tall larkspur, because tall larkspur has a strong toxin in it, an alkaloid. We learned about that earlier in class. So he thought, well, maybe he could get animals to eat larkspur, and then he could avert them to larkspur with lithium chloride. So here's the results. In 1993, he averted a group of cattle to larkspur, and they ate 0, the percent of bites that were larkspur. They ate 0, whereas a control group that had larkspur and did not get the lithium chloride, they ate about 20 bites. And he did it again in 94. The animals that were averted did not eat larkspur, and those that had larkspur and not having had lithium chloride in the past, they continued to eat it, 12 bites. Again, a year later, the averted ones continued to avoid larkspur, not taking any bites of it, and the control animals did eat larkspur. In this case, 11 bites. Okay, after he did that reading in 1995, and what he was doing, he was watching animals out on the range and looking for how many bites of larkspur they ate. At that point, right after that data, he put the animals together to see what would happen, and the results were stunning. So on the left of that line here, the control animals, they increased and decreased intake over the years. The days on the bottom are all the way from 93 through 95. In August 95, he put the animals together, and you'll see that right away, the animals that had been averted and not eaten larkspur for years started eating larkspur. So just within a few days, the animals started following their peers and started eating more larkspur. So lifelong aversions are difficult to create in ruminants, and you could potentially use lithium chloride to help animals avoid poisonous plants, but you would have to train the whole herd in order to do that. So peers do have an influence on intake. Another principle we got to think about is not only do animals have to learn what to eat and what to avoid, they also have to learn how to eat. This idea of learning how to eat is called developing foraging skills. So let's take a look at some foraging skills here. Here's a video that will show goats eating blackbrush, and that's in this picture. Blackbrush, Coleogene ramosissima, is a perennial shrub that grows in the southwest, southern Utah into New Mexico and Arizona. And it's this graph will show animals that are experienced with foraging on blackbrush and those that aren't. So put the video right here. Okay, so that's pretty convincing. You don't need much data to show that the animals that ate the blackbrush were really well, they learned how to eat it and they ate it quickly. Another colleague, Enrique Flores, did an experiment where he asked if sheep that grew up eating grass, were they better at eating grass than sheep that grew up eating shrubs, and vice versa. If sheep grew up eating shrubs, would they be better at eating shrubs than grass eaters? So that's what he did. He raised a group of lambs that were conditioned to eat pots of crested wheatgrass, and he raised a group of lambs that were conditioned for eating serviceberry. And then he just tested. He just looked at ingestion rates on, in this case, crested wheatgrass, a grass, and serviceberry, a shrub. And it's clear. When he looked at the grams eaten per minute, the ingestion rate of grass, the grass eaters ate grass faster. They were more able to eat it. They ate more grams per minute. However, the shrub eaters, those that had been conditioned to eat shrubs, ate shrubs more quickly. And there's a little bit of difference here. It looks like grass is apparently a more difficult food to prehend, so the grass eaters also did pretty well on the shrubs. but still the shrub eaters did better. Okay, blackbrush is a plant that Dr. Preferences and his colleagues have been studying for a number of years because it's a plant that's not terribly palatable. It has quite a few secondary compounds in them. Chief among them is some tannins and like a host of other secondary compounds. So Fred has been really interested in what would it take to get animals that could eat this food that is normally not very palatable. And one of the principles that has been revealed from this research is that early life experience is really important in getting animals to eat foods, especially foods that are not normally palatable or not normally digestible. So here's an example of goats eating blackbrush. In this experiment, Dr. Preferences took goats that were 6 weeks of age, and he randomly divided them into those that were experienced, that were going to become experienced, and he raised them with their mothers out on blackbrush range in southern Utah. Another group was designated as becoming inexperienced and not having experience with blackbrush, so they were inexperienced. And he raised those lambs and their mothers on dry lot in fed alfalfa pellets in Logan. So it's 26 weeks of age. Roberto Distill, one of Fred's students, weaned those lambs and brought them all back to Logan. So at 26 weeks of age, he weaned them. At 28 weeks of age, he offered all the goats blackbrush in pens. So we used to kid Roberto about doing these all-you-can-eat juniper trials, or all-you-can-eat blackbrush trials. So he basically put individual goats in pens, and he gave them branches of blackbrush until they could eat no more. And here's the results. The very first time that he offered goats blackbrush, so this is day 1 through day 13, you can see that the experienced goats, the ones who had had it early in life, ate almost twice as much amount of blackbrush per day as opposed to the inexperienced. And yeah, there's a little variation from day to day, but both groups are going up and down, and in all cases the experienced animals are eating twice as much blackbrush as those inexperienced animals. Then he waited for 13 months, so he waited about another year later to see how persistent this was. And that first day that he offered blackbrush, you'll see the number is fairly low. It was the animals were kind of getting used to the protocol again. Then they increased and increased and increased. And even though the difference between these two bars, 13 months, are a little bit different than the bars from 4 months of age, still there was a significant difference. The experienced animals continued to eat more blackbrush even a year later. So it turns out that having the right foraging skills and the right digestion and then the right preferences for foods, that those things could last for quite some time, at least in this case for at least a year. And the reason for that is because interactions matter. We don't always have to know exactly what it was that changed in the animal, but we know that you are what you eat. Your body changes based on what kinds of foods you eat. So experience, dietary foraging experience, transforms the body. It changes the physiology, the morphology, and the neurology of the body. And the body transforms experience. So if a goat, for example, it becomes better at digesting and using blackbrush, then blackbrush is going to be a better food for them. It's going to give them a better experience. So the experience transforms the body transforms the experience, and over and over and over and over again. So that interaction is really important. I'll offer just 3 examples of how foraging transforms the body. This first one was a study that was done in the lab with rats, and Cooper, Smith, and Leon, they were looking at whether the flavor of peppermint, the odor of peppermint, would excite rats. So what they did was one group was experienced with peppermint and got some positive feedback when they were given peppermint, and the other group had no experience with peppermint. And what you see here is that this uptake of glucose in the body. When you see a lot of glucose going around the body, that's a sign that the body is stimulated. So the animals that had peppermint experience, when they smelled peppermint, they got excited and they had more glucose going around in their body than the inexperienced animals. And the graphs on the right are slides that show brain activity the top graph is inexperienced animals. You don't see a lot of real activity. That lighter color is where you would indicate activity, whereas the bottom picture of that rat's brain shows some dark red areas and a lot of light areas that are looking at kind of neuron excitement in the brain in response to peppermint. So neurologically, experience with peppermint changes the brain and the way it fires and the way the body works neurologically. Experience also changes morphology. There's two different studies here. The one on the left, those goats that were out in southern Utah, remember we had the inexperienced and the experienced. One of the things that Roberto Distill did is he harvested some of those animals and looked at their rumen weight, and it turns out that those that had been grazing all summer long on black brush range had larger rumens per body mass. You know, for their size, they had larger rumens than those that had been on feedlot just eating alfalfa pellets. So the fact that they were out there eating that diverse diet with lots of fiber gave them larger rumens. The rumens on the right, those pictures of rumens sitting on the grass, the top one is darker and has longer papillae than the bottom right-hand side. And the only difference between those two rumens is that the one on the top was from a group of animals that went out. They were in Du Bois, Idaho, and then they went up into the Centennial Mountains and lived up there that summer on range. The animals on the bottom was a group of animals that they were in Du Bois, but they had been given some grain early in their life, so they learned to eat grain. They went up on the mountain for the summer, but when they came back in the fall, their gut still looked different because they had had grain early in life. So it changed the mineral content and then the actual papillae length in their gut. So having experience with grain changed their rumen composition. And then finally, physiology. Those goats out in southern Utah, again, one of the things that Roberto did when he fed those inexperienced and experienced goats black brushes, he took some blood samples and he looked for glucuronic acid. Glucuronic acid would be a sign that the animal was actively detoxifying something. It's a sign that the liver is really kind of kicked into high gear and is really doing detoxification. And you'll see that the higher bar, that blue bar, when animals ate blackbrush, the experienced ones started detoxifying those compounds in blackbrush right away. And as we know, that allowed them to eat more blackbrush. So this is a study that showed that experience with blackbrush, in this case, changed the physiology, the detoxification that the animal was able to accomplish. So here's some key points. It's kind of a long and drawn-out process, but here's the balls to keep your eye on. Palatability depends on feedback. Nothing is inherently good or inherently bad. The animal has to eat it and link the flavor of the food to the feedback from the food. And based on that, animals can detect positive and negative feedback. They're very good at it. Furthermore, animals can discriminate based on those flavor feedback interactions. They form conditioned preferences for flavors and foods that yielded positive feedback, and they form conditioned aversions for flavors and foods that formed negative feedback. So positive feedback, such as an energy boost or satiation or protein satisfaction, those would create preferences in animals, whereas negative feedback, such as feeling nauseous or just feeling hungry, could create a conditioned aversion. Another thing we know about preferences and aversions is that the magnitude of feedback matters. The more beneficial, the more positive the feedback, the stronger the preference. The more negative the feedback, the stronger the aversion. A few more key points. When animals are eating a variety of foods a day, they still have mechanisms to figure out what made them feel good or what made them feel ill. The most important mechanism among those is that animals blame illness on novel foods. So novelty is very important. Another important principle from today's discussion is that social facilitation is one of the most important tools that animals use for figuring out what to eat and what to avoid. And mother is the most important of those social models, although peers are also important. Animals need to learn not only what to eat, but how to eat, and those are called foraging skills, and they can be quite difficult to develop, and once they're developed, they can last for quite some time. Early in life, animals learn what to eat and avoid, and that early life experience is especially important. Certainly animals can learn throughout their life, but just like any animal, humans, rats, probably snails, anything, the experiences they have when they're young are often more influential because the animal is more malleable and more able to learn and grow and change. The final point is that interactions matter. The interactions between food and the body matter. Structure determines experience. Experience determines structure of the body. So those are the main key points from today's discussion. You can learn a great deal more by going to behave.net. I'd like to especially thank Beth Burrett for helping with this presentation. She posts her presentations online at the link that's given at the bottom of this page by going to behave.net. And she was involved in much of this of these experiments and helped me get the data on which experiments resulted in which findings. I'm going to just list all of the references that were given in today's presentation to show you that this is a whole host of people that work mostly out of Fred Prevenz's lab, and that I had the pleasure to work with many of these scientists. So that's it for today on the principles that underlie diet selection. The reason this is important is because we're going to try to change diet selection as we try to manage lands in the next section of this class. So understanding the principles that mediate diet selection is very important.